Welcome to, good morning. Welcome to the optimizing harnessing AI to enhance health outcomes seminar series. Today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Philip Payne from Washington University, St. Louis, and he will be presenting his work on AI in the future of health and healthcare, moving from overload to insight. Go ahead. My name is Sean David, and I am Program Director for Translational Science Outcomes Research at Endeavor Health, and I'm joined by Rachel Brewington, who is our Administrator for the Health Research Outcomes Collaborative. The objectives for this seminar series are to share applied AI research to improve health outcomes, to connect researchers and healthcare scientists in Chicagoland, to foster collaboration, and to promote translational research and innovation. As we start, I'd like to give a special thanks to our speakers today, Dr. Payne. We'll also be joined by Dr. Anthony Solomonides, and to Rachel Brewington, who makes this seminar possible, and also to send out a thank you to everyone working on the front lines in health and healthcare to advance population health and health equity. This seminar is also intended for learners, and we think that it's an ideal time to be having a landscape covering seminar series on how we can use AI to really maximize health outcomes. And the horizon is broad, from medical imaging, personalized medicine, telemedicine, using ambient AI to better capture patients' concerns, and also with documentation and efficiency, but especially as well in clinical and translational science. And so we're covering this today with a really broad scale brush, talk about the future of healthcare that is presently on our footstep. Next slide, please. So the learning objective of today's seminar is to explain how artificial intelligence augments rather than replaces human decision-making in complex health and healthcare systems, including the strengths and limitations of current AI and generative AI approaches, and why issues such as data quality, bias, validation, and workflow integration are central to real-world impact. We're presenting this today to align with our Clinical and Translational Science Award, the Institute for Translational Medicine, and our selection of topics and speakers captures each of these translational science principles: creativity and innovation, focusing on unmet needs, such as we spoke before the seminar about the need to better improve the quality of care in remote rural areas, as well as in some of the diverse urban areas where we have food deserts and cancer hotspots. This technology is incredibly exciting because of its potential to address those unmet needs, and with generalizable solutions that we've seen applied in very different parts of the country and globally. Cross-disciplinary team science, efficiency, and speed. And these are bold and rigorous approaches that address diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, as well as crossing boundaries. So this hits on all 8 of those principles. Rachel, next slide, please. And I'll pass this over to Rachel to talk about claiming CME credit for today's seminar.
Thank you very much. To mark attendance for today for CME credit for today's seminar, text the SMS code that is now in the chat. Please disregard the SMS code on the screen. I will be updating that later, but in the chat, the SMS code is there. You can text to the number on the screen to claim your CME. Physicians may claim up to 1.5 AMA PRA Category 1 credits based on participation today. Other healthcare professionals will receive a certificate of participation. Please check with your licensing board for credit eligibility. A CME flyer will be sent to everyone today that will have full instructions on how to retrieve your CME credit, the same instructions that are linked today in the chat. You'll be muted today during the seminar, but feel free to use the chat to ask questions and share comments. Be mindful of your audience and send messages to both panelists and attendees so everyone can join in the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, and please do throughout the seminar, if you have a thought or a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll track those throughout. So the outline of the seminar today is after the introduction, we will have the lecture. During the lecture, you can also enter questions for the Q&A, which will come at the end for about 5 minutes. Rachel will read those to Dr. Payne. Following that, we have the Beat the Bot, Ask the Professor forum, which we have developed to allow us to ask questions and solicit questions from the speaker that we have done and run through AI open evidence. And based on those responses, we will have an internet poll to get a sense from the participants how relevant, how useful, and how it helps to expand and focus our thinking about these health challenges. I think that's a lot of fun, and we've done this now. So this is our 4th time. And we have some questions from Dr. Payne that we're going to be giving to open evidence. And then we'll have some closing remarks. So without any further ado, it's a privilege to welcome Dr. Philip Payne. Dr. Payne is the president and chair of the FAMIA Board of Directors, effective this year. He also has served as the board chair and president, providing exceptional leadership for the AMA community for many years. He also serves as the vice chancellor for biomedical informatics and data science at Washington University in St. Louis and WashU Medicine. And he's the chief health AI officer for BJC Health and WashU Medicine. He holds the Janet and Bernard Becker Professorship and is the founding director of the Institute for Informatics, Data Science, and Biostatistics. Additionally, Dr. Payne serves as a professor of general internal medicine and computing science and engineering. With over 300 publications, Dr. Payne leads research in AI-driven methods for discovering and analyzing biomolecular clinical phenotypes, interventional applications of electronic health records and clinical decision support, human factors and workflow optimization in healthcare IT, and the development of data sharing and analytics platforms. He is an elected fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics, American Medical Informatics Association, AMIA, American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering, and the International Academy of Health Sciences Informatics. Beyond academia, Dr. Payne is an active entrepreneur, having funded multiple digital health companies and serves as an advisor in multiple governance roles in health and life sciences companies. I saw Dr. Payne speak on a panel at the National Academy of Medicine in October, and I think he was absolutely brilliant. And so we are delighted, Philip, for you to join us today, and we will hand the baton over to you.
Great, thank you. I think you covered all of my topic matter just in the introduction, so we should just go straight to the Q&A. So really happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Great. Okay. So first and foremost, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to have a chance to connect with colleagues, especially here in the Midwest. And with the exception of, some occasional baseball-related rivalries, I think that we have a lot in common between the Chicago area and St. Louis. So hopefully a lot of this content will resonate with all of you. So as Sean said, what I really want to do is talk about current and future state of AI as it relates to both healthcare delivery, but also sort of health and life sciences more broadly. And a theme in this talk is really going to be, how can we use these technologies to help our human beings move from a current state of overload, especially when we think about the amount of data that we are encountering every day, to a state where we're actually able to gain insights from those data and make better, smarter, faster decisions. So that's really going to be the key narrative arc of what I want to talk about today. So for starters, and I don't think I have to emphasize this point with an audience like this, but we are in a period of really profound technical change. And that technical change is happening because many of the AI technologies that we have previously sort of understood in a theoretical or perhaps laboratory-based setting have suddenly become practical and scalable to the real world. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to, but these technologies are not new. However, the ways in which we can use them have suddenly become very different very quickly, and they are now becoming widespread and commonplace. And so I do love this quote from the CEO of Microsoft, which alludes to the fact that not only is AI transformative, but it's particularly transformative when we think about the challenges that we encounter every day in health and healthcare. Now, this is what I often tell people is sort of the cheat sheet to AI development. And what I really want you to take away from this is while some of the applications of artificial intelligence are quite sophisticated, the fundamentals are relatively simple. At the end of the day, we are going to collect some set of data. This data can take many different forms across many scales and modalities. And we are going to train a model, some sort of computational agent that can interpret that data and either identify important patterns or produce new content based upon patterns that have been previously interpreted. And then we're going to put that into the real world. People are going to use it. They're going to provide feedback. We're going to monitor and ideally optimize the use of that technology, and then we're going to repeat. And if you take nothing else from this slide, it's that the creation and use of AI is a dynamic process. It is not unidirectional. We do not create a model and sort of unleash it into the real world, but rather we build a model, we deploy it, we use it, we learn, and then we repeat that cycle many times over. And that does present a lot of challenges, which I'll get to later in terms of how do we think about the governance, regulatory, ethical, and social implications of AI, because these are technologies that sometimes have emergent behaviors because of that dynamic nature. Now, I won't read all these, but I often want to start a talk like this with a few key concepts because I'm going to use phrases not only like artificial intelligence, but also generative AI. This is AI, as I just alluded to a moment ago, that can generate new content in response to some sort of prompt or definition of a feature space. Machine learning, probably quite familiar to all of you. This is when we use AI to learn patterns from existing data. And deep learning is really sort of an advanced form of machine learning that gets much closer to the way that the human brain works as compared to, say, more statistical modeling-based approaches to machine learning. But the one thing I want you to take away, and I like this infographic from Gartner, is that depending on sort of the use case, the problem that you're trying to solve using AI, and the available technologies, there are different types of technologies that are sort of well suited to that use case, and they exhibit different degrees of maturity. This is really important because if you were to sort of go back even a few years ago before the explosion of interest in generative AI, if you went into a room, you probably would find a number of sort of data scientists and AI researchers that would say the only solution is deep learning. That is not true. There are many cases where alternative forms of machine learning, rule-based systems, other types of more sort of conventional AI are highly accurate, appropriate, and scalable. So this is not sort of a situation where there's one set of tools, but rather there's a large toolbox of tools that are well established, that are emergent, and that all sort of align with use cases depending on sort of the problem that you are trying to solve for. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the one thing I want to say at the outset is that AI in health and healthcare today is not about replacing humans. And I know there's a lot of concern about that, but I'm going to make the case, and I hope you will agree with me by the end of this talk, that in the vast majority of use cases, AI in health and healthcare is about augmenting human decision making. And I've included this infographic, which is from a very well-known paper in the informatics literature explaining a fundamental theorem for the field of biomedical informatics. This was originally published by my good friend and colleague, Chuck Friedman, that basically argues that it is the combination of humans and computers working together that is superior to either working alone. And I certainly think, given the current state of maturity of AI, that is where we see these tools in the health and healthcare domain. That's largely because we as humans are very good at making sense of the world around us through a process of pattern recognition. So my favorite simple example I use is that if you walked into a physical room and you looked at a table, you would recognize that it is a table. That's not because you have an encyclopedic knowledge of what every table in the world looks like, but rather you have a pattern that you have learned that a table might have a top and legs, and if I set something on it, it's unlikely to fall off. And you use those patterns to basically assign that classification to what you are seeing and decide that that is a table. Humans are very good at this type of pattern recognition. Now, computers can engage in similar pattern recognition if we teach them how to, and they can certainly do it faster and at a greater scale or scope than humans can. But humans have some ability to overcome limitations that computers face in this arena, such as, is there enough data to train the computer in order to be able to recognize those patterns? Are there biases in those data? Is the computational work itself too costly? And how does the computer interact in this dynamic environment that is not sort of a silo in which the computer sort of operates in a vacuum? And it's because of those sort of trade-offs between unique human cognitive abilities in pattern recognition and then sort of the speed and scale of computational approaches that try to replicate that human ability that I would argue that most AI that we interact with today appears intelligent because it's faster and deals with more data than we can. And it's not because AI is actually smarter than humans, with a few rare exceptions. So again, I want to start with this framing that AI in health and healthcare is about augmenting human decision making because it is that combination of AI and humans working together that is superior to either working alone. And this leads to an opportunity to sort of revisit a common sort of conceptual framework of a learning health system and think about it as an AI-enabled learning health system. Because the reality is that what we want out of the learning health system is an environment where we instrument all of the different activities and sort of settings in which we interact with patients or human beings. We collect data, we analyze that data, and we generate insights. We then have, as a result of those insights, information, right? Contextualized data. And we want to deliver that in the right time, place, and format so people can make better decisions. That becomes knowledge. And then we want to see what happens when we deliver that knowledge and really measure impact and then repeat the process based on what we learn from that impact. And in the past, this has been very hard to achieve because the sheer volumes of data have really been insurmountable for us to tackle. But with AI, back to this idea that AI is very good at interpreting patterns at a scale and speed that humans cannot, we're suddenly confronted with a set of tools that makes this type of model, this iterative refinement where we're constantly learning, applying evidence, and optimizing possible in ways that it hasn't been before. However, this is not simple. And so there is a lot of work to do to prepare our organizations, whether we be research-oriented, teaching and learning-oriented, or involved in clinical care. There is a lot of work to be done to prepare ourselves to be able to adopt and use these technologies because, like I said, they're dynamic, they are complex, and I'll come back to the idea of complexity in a few slides, and they require us to sort of re-engineer workflows in new and innovative ways. And I often tell people, if you bolt AI onto an existing bad workflow, you will still get a bad result. AI is not an easy button to get around having solid data strategy or clinical transformation strategies. And so that leads to the need to really think about sort of what do we have to do as a community to be ready to adopt and adapt these types of innovative technologies? Well, for starters, we have to have a workforce that's actually aware of and able to apply these technologies in the right time, place, and format. And that's where events like this one become so important. We also have to make sure we're starting to think about educating our clinicians to be proficient in an AI-enabled practice. These technologies are not benign. They impact human cognition. So we need to understand where and how we're using them and how that might impact clinical decision-making and outcomes. And we have to embed continuous learning into AI implementation. We cannot treat it like sort of traditional views of evidence-based practice where we write a paper, we then produce a guideline, and everybody uses it, and we hope for the best. This is really about that constant feedback cycle that I showed on the previous slide. And so fundamentally, we have to reshape governance, staffing, training, technology delivery, all in order to be able to address these needs. So with that as a preamble, why do I think that now is the time really to double down on the use of AI, especially to support decision-making in really what is an unmanageable environment where we are drowning in a sea of data today? Well, for starters, we have seen throughout history many different instances of step changes in technology that have both presented substantial opportunity, but also have caused some appropriate concern. And so we have to put this use of AI in the health and life sciences in that context. So what do I mean? At almost every major stage in which an information technology, and I mean that in the broadest possible way, has been released into the real world, and it has represented a step change in capability, there has been both tremendous opportunity and tremendous popular concerns. And you can see sort of a rough timeline here of various technologies dating back to the printing press, to the advent of personal computers, and now today, AI, and in particular, generative AI like large language models. And every single time a new technology like this has arrived on the scene, people have gotten concerned. For example, with the printing press, there were many people that were worried that by democratizing printed materials, we would diminish their value and people would not sort of pay close enough attention to sort of the unique benefit of reading and consuming sort of books or pamphlets or papers. So imagine that. People thought that making printed content more readily available would really impede human cognition and critical thinking. I think we can all agree that the widespread availability of books and printed material has actually proven to be a positive for society. Or take something like personal computers or the internet or smartphones, where there has been sort of a moral crisis around how are these technologies going to impact human decision making and should we be worried about them? I think it's pretty hard to imagine a world now where we don't use computers in sort of really critical data intensive environments. And right now, we are facing a similar set of popular concerns around AI and large language models. One of the most common concerns in healthcare is this idea of de-skilling. What if we give AI to clinicians and they lose critical reasoning skills as a function of over-reliance on AI, and this negatively impacts their ability to practice medicine? And I would argue that right now, we have to learn how to teach clinicians to be able to use these technologies appropriately and understand their impact. And that's no different than when we had to teach individuals in health and healthcare to think about how to use electronic medical records, or dating back to my first example, even the idea of exchanging knowledge in the form of journals or other printed materials. And so I start with that as sort of a historical framing that while we should be appropriately cautious, we should not be cynical, because every single time we've had a step change in technology like this, we have actually arrived at sort of a new level of human performance. One of the reasons why I think this is possible is because there really is sort of this unique interplay between human cognitive capacity and computers. And I talked about this earlier, but I want to go a little bit deeper on this. For starters, we as humans have sort of unique cognitive abilities to recognize patterns, but we're also limited in how much information we can deal with. In fact, the human brain is optimized to reason on around 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at any point in time. It's actually why telephone numbers are the length that they are, so you can remember them and use them. Although, to be honest with you, I don't know any telephone numbers because of my smartphone, but that's a different talk altogether. We also have issues with multitasking. In fact, humans don't multitask, we task switch. We may switch tasks very quickly, and it may appear that we're able to sort of parallel process, but the human brain actually doesn't operate in that manner. We do have cognitive biases, and there is sort of certainly an influence of emotion on how we make decisions. Our memory is fallible, and we can suffer from mental fatigue and overload. And there's been much written about that in the context of clinical decision making over the last several decades. And so, for starters, while we're very good at pattern recognition, we do have these deficits that we need to acknowledge. And these are deficits that often make it hard to navigate the data and information intensive environment that we're faced with in health and healthcare. But as I have already alluded to, we also have these unique abilities, right? We can be creative and innovative. We can come up with new ways to think about problem domains. And by the way, even the most advanced generative AI tools are really what has been referred to in the computer science literature in more sort of pejorative terms, stochastic parrots. They are simply replaying to us content that has been previously generated that they have learned from and they believe is the most likely answer to the prompt or question we put in front of them. They are not generating new knowledge, but rather they are synthesizing and delivering existing knowledge. We, on the other hand, can develop new knowledge. We do have emotional intelligence, and health and healthcare is an emotionally laden domain. So we can understand how decisions and conversations and interactions impact the emotional well-being of the patients and populations we interact with. We have contextual understanding. We can look at a systems level and understand how context influences decision-making in a way that computers cannot. We are adaptable, we can learn, and we can engage in moral and ethical reasoning. And it's for those reasons that we really need those two threads to come together. And bringing them together is even more important when you think about the environment that we're working in health and healthcare. Now, we often use the phrases complicated or complex sort of interchangeably, but they actually mean different things. Because a complicated system is one in which we have a lot of different interacting parts, but in reality, with enough modeling, enough analysis, we can predict how those parts will interact and what outcomes they will produce given a set of inputs. In a complex system, there are many interacting components with emergent features. We do not know all the structural and functional relationships between them. And there are, as I've alluded to, sort of self-organizing or emergent properties that are unexpected and may not be consistent every time we interact with those systems. So in effect, a complicated system is one that if we work hard enough, we can understand and model in its entirety. And a complex system is where, because of gaps in human knowledge or expertise or available data or methods, we cannot fully model and predict outcomes. And I'm going to make the argument that health and healthcare is without a doubt a complex system. So back to the point I was making earlier, humans are good at pattern recognition. We have strengths and weaknesses. Ideally, humans and AI working together are better than either working alone. And we are situating all of this in this complex system where we're constantly having to learn and react to these emergent or sort of self-organizing properties. And like I said, health and healthcare, without a doubt, is a complex system. And by the way, this has been written about basically dating back to the 1950s. Actually, I quoted a book here, which I love the name of because it makes it sound like it's science fiction. But this book, Cybernetics, talks about using computation to sort of manage large, complex systems and uses healthcare as an example. And that is because, as I've already said, health and healthcare have sort of this incredible array of independent components: humans, their patients, whether they're providers, whether they're community members, there's data, there's tools, there's knowledge resources. Again, really, really sort of an incredible array of environmental features. There are nonlinear reactions between all those various features. There's adaptive behaviors. People change their behavior over time. There are these unpredictable outcomes. We don't have comprehensive knowledge of human biology and disease, so we don't always know what's going to happen. And there's really diverse expertise, which is why we have specialization in healthcare. And unfortunately, and I love this quote from Atul Gawande, while we look, and I'm going to read this, for medicine to be an orderly field of knowledge and procedure, it is not. It's an imperfect science, an enterprise of constantly changing knowledge, uncertain information, fallible individuals, and at the same time, lives are on the line. And so the stakes are high, it's a complex system, and we need to find better ways to interact with that complex system, given sort of the reality of what we are confronted with versus what we might want health and healthcare to be. Now, I mentioned that there are these step changes in technology, and I gave you a few working definitions, but without a doubt, today we're seeing this sort of rapid acceleration of the availability of really, really high-performing and sort of scalable AI technologies. There's been much written about this, including books where actual large language models are co-authors. But as you can see here, we are moving into an environment where the combination of sort of advanced statistical and machine learning methods, as well as sort of multimodal or multi-scale AI, and now generative AI, all linked together, allow us to build adaptive systems that can really help us to succeed in this complex environment. And I think of that as a very exciting time where we can start to harness all this data and maybe start translating health and healthcare into what is more of a complicated system than a complex system. There are many different capabilities that AI provides us in that setting that I just described. And I'm not going to read all these, but they span a spectrum from helping us to better collect and analyze and render fit for sort of interpretation all of this data that's produced in healthcare, allows us to deliver decision support in the right time, place, and format so that we can use the best available data and evidence to optimize outcomes for patients and populations. And we can also do things like reduce errors, reduce potential deleterious outcomes of treatment. And we can also think about how do we allocate resources more efficiently in health and healthcare, which is a major problem, right? Access, affordability, and value are going to be sort of really the existential questions for healthcare over the next several decades. And we can use these very same tools that help us make clinical decisions to also make decisions around sort of how do we more efficiently use our resources. And there are many different ways in which that manifests in the health and healthcare environment, whether that be examining the existing knowledge base, whether that be in papers or otherwise, helping us to manage our data, helping us to interpret medical images, helping us to deliver precision medicine, or like I said earlier, providing contextual clinical decision support. And these are just a few of many examples where AI can have impact. But we as a community, the people that are designing, deploying, evaluating, and using AI in the health and healthcare environment, we really have to think critically around sort of, are we framing these opportunities the right way? I'm going to start with sort of question number one that we should all consider. When we're using AI, is the task that we're targeting the right type of task? And to be blunt, not all tasks require AI. Some, which involve a lot of pattern recognition or classification or reasoning over large amounts of data, are totally the right types of use cases for AI. But others simply are not, whether that be sort of navigating patient preferences in clinical decision making or, end of life planning, as an example. We also have to think about what are sort of the standards that we use to assess the performance of AI in the health and healthcare setting. One of my favorite conversations here at WashU and BJC is when people say, how do we know that the notes that are produced by ambient scribe technologies are as good as the notes produced by our humans? Well, human-generated notes are actually deeply flawed. Why would that be the benchmark? They have missing data. They are incomplete. They are inconsistent. So whatever we decide to choose as a benchmark has a profound impact on how we assess success for AI. And importantly, where should the AI be positioned in the organization to make sure it's usable, again, in the right time, place, and format? Is it a decision support tool? Is it working autonomously? Or is it something else altogether? We really have to think about those workflow and human factors dimensions that sort of influence the optimal deployment of these technologies. Second, even if the task is right and we understand how to evaluate success, we have to make sure we have the right data in order to both train and operate these types of models. And I will say from the outset, many people imagine AI as sort of, and I said this before, an easy button that gets you out of dealing with sort of the complexities of data strategy. It does not. In fact, what it does is it makes your data strategy 200, 300, 1,000% more important than it was before. Because AI is only as good as the data that we train it on, and the data we use to operationalize it, and the data that we use to evaluate it. So we really have to start thinking about what are the limitations in existing clinical workflow and systems that may influence the availability of data. Do we need to use more advanced methods like natural language processing or more patient-generated data sources to augment what we have on hand in order to make these models practicable? And how do we make sure that the data sets that we're using are sufficiently representative of the populations that we serve, that they don't introduce biases or sort of blind spots in our analyses? And then third, and I already alluded to this, how do we know if we are measuring success appropriately? And I already sort of talked about this, but we have to sort of understand what risk are we willing to take on and what's the benefit that accrues? What lessons can we learn from other technology-enabled domains, such as drug and device regulation, that might help us to think about this more critically? And how do we get beyond just sort of the accuracy of these tools and also think about sort of workflow integration, cognitive burden, or even the environmental or physical costs of the computational infrastructure needed to operationalize AI? And these are all dimensions of analysis that really require a systems view of how AI is deployed, used, and then measured in the clinical setting. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes about sort of the challenge of answering all of those questions. And this is from my colleague, Karandeep Singh, who's the Chief Health AI Officer at UC San Diego. And I'm going to read this because this is a really important message. Researched models are rarely implemented, and implemented models are rarely researched. So today, really the current state of the art, most of the AI tools that we encounter come from our vendor or technology partners, and they're generally pretty lightly researched or understood in terms of their performance, despite all the questions that I just alluded to. Meanwhile, many of the best models that we can produce from an accuracy, performance, and evaluation standpoint exist only in the research setting and are rarely translated because of complexity, governance, technical, and other issues that prevent them moving from the research to the operational arena. This is a point of friction that we must address as a community, because we are not putting our best foot forward by really saying that only those systems that come from sort of technology vendors are able to be scaled into the clinical environment. So with that, I want to shift and give a few examples from the literature that talk to sort of some of the facts, fiction, and sort of future directions for the field. How do we sort of really put all those threads that I've just introduced together, sort of the complexity of healthcare, the availability of AI, the fundamental questions that we need to ask about how AI can optimally augment human performance. How do all those collide in both a constructive or perhaps critical way that influences healthcare? So number one, I think it goes without saying, and hopefully you will agree with me, that we have a lot of work to do to show that AI can reliably and sort of consistently replicate expert clinician performance. There's a lot of literature. There are numerous studies, quasi-experimental studies, all the way through formal RCTs, showing the comparison of AI-driven decision-making relative to human decision-making. And what the real takeaway of these studies are is that the quality of the model, the degree to which it's adequately integrated into workflow, the sort of sophistication of the evaluation, and the suitability of the task being sort of targeted all collide to influence whether or not AI is able to reliably replicate human performance. And so I would start by making the case that there's a lot of really formative research to still be done to build the evidence base that tells us when, where, and how AI can be used to reliably and consistently replicate expert performance. However, while there's a lot of open questions, there is reason to be very optimistic because there are now numerous cases where AI has replicated or even exceeded human capabilities. So I cite here an example of a study that actually came out of our own informatics research group, where we looked at a predictive model that could assess the risk of surgical blood loss and use that to inform perioperative decision-making around who gets typed and screened and how much blood gets sent to the OR, and really at a goal of reducing wastage of blood products in the OR and unnecessary laboratory testing that incurs costs. And the takeaway here is that by using a very robust data set from the MPOD consortium across 50 plus large academic health centers, we could produce a highly accurate model that exceeded any of the current decision-making rubrics. And now we actually have a prospective study of this underway in our peri-op clinics. And my point with this is that if you construct rigorous studies and you build the evidence base and you think about the task and the data that's available, you can get results where you can improve human decision-making. This is a model that is more accurate, wastes less blood product, and incurs less cost for laboratory testing than existing human-based, largely heuristic processes for making decisions around how do we plan for surgical blood loss. So with the right approaches, the right methodologic rigor, we can demonstrate that these tools can have positive impact. There's also a very large set of questions that exist around how do humans and AI interact with each other, especially in high stakes examples. So this is another example from our own research group that actually focuses on a relatively sensitive question, which is when we are presented with a patient in the emergency department or some other part of the healthcare system that has a high, either acute or chronic disease burden and an extremely high mortality risk, it's important that we actually have a conversation about their goals of care and potentially end-of-life planning. Unfortunately, that rarely happens in the healthcare system. And so what we've done here is actually build a predictive model that sort of anticipates that potential risk and prompts varieties of sort of providers across the care continuum to have a discussion with the patient around their goals of care and end-of-life planning. Or if it's presented in an acute care environment, allows for an order set to be entered into the EHR to have a palliative care consult before that patient, for example, gets admitted to the ICU. And what we've learned from this is that this combination of humans and AI working together to have these very sensitive conversations with our patients have actually resulted in high levels of satisfaction from patients and their families. People have avoided ICU admissions and instead been diverted into hospice or other palliative care settings and had a superior end-of-life experience than those that might otherwise have been admitted to the ICU without actually having had that goal of care conversation. But I want to point out, and if you read this article, the key is it is the human and AI working together with the patient and their family that generates this result. Not any of these components are individuals or tools working alone. Now, I do feel it's important to acknowledge that there are a limited or small number of use cases, in particular in the image analysis domain, where AI tools are outperforming humans. And we do need to acknowledge that, right? Today, we have AI-driven tools that can find incidental pulmonary emboli in any chest image that's taken in our inpatient setting. Or similarly, we have tools that can interpret chest CTs and actually find nodules in the lungs that humans will not find. The real takeaway here is that in these sort of highly data intense pattern recognition tasks where we have large amounts of data like radiology and pathology, we can build very high performing algorithms that augment human performance. And I think this is a case where we have to think about augmenting human performance in a systems lens. So what we're really doing is freeing up our radiologists to focus on those more complex cases where the data and pattern recognition is not as clear, right? So we're taking relatively simple tasks and we're expediting the generation of clinically actionable results while we're taking our humans and repositioning them to focus on much more complex imaging modalities in cases where human pattern recognition is still desperately needed because computers cannot identify those patterns or interpret those images. I also think, despite a lot of cynicism about this, patient perception around the use of AI is increasingly positive, as long as we have appropriate disclosures and transparency. There's actually a relatively now famous paper that shows when you use AI to generate responses to patient messages in a patient portal, and you basically do the blind taste test between human-generated and computer-generated messages, that by and large, patients perceive the computer-generated messages as being more timely and more compassionate. It's actually because the computer does not get tired or they're not writing the message at 11 or 11:30 at night. But the reality is that with appropriate disclosure, for example, letting patients know that AI was used to generate this response and transparency around which parts of the response were generated by the human versus the computer, there is increasingly positive feedback. But I want to emphasize this point one more time. It is when we have appropriately used sort of our toolbox, which includes transparency and disclosure, that these positive results accrue. I also think we are starting to see real benefit for providers. And we know that documentation burden is a major challenge for us. Certainly, ambient scribes have been presented as a potential solution to that. I cited one paper here from a study that was produced by another organization different than ours. This is a study from Kaiser Permanente Medical Group. We actually have a paper now in press that shows our own results with our initial 500 provider trial, where we show at least a 2-hour per week savings in documentation time for our primary care providers, an increase in work RVUs, and a qualitative assessment that our providers are spending less time documenting and more time interacting with our patients, and similarly qualitative results that are highly positive from our patients. And that's not unique to us. We are increasingly seeing this as we explore these technologies. I'm going to argue that these sorts of technologies that reduce documentation burden are going to become largely table stakes, no different than having dictation or other technologies, but they are a sort of gateway to other very interesting applications of AI, like automated prior authorization at the point of care, or improved chart summarization, or improvements in post-visit patient education materials driven by customized interpretation of what was discussed during the encounter. So overall, this is about improving not only the patient experience, but also improving the provider experience by addressing some of the aspects of care that perhaps have reduced humanism and reduced patient-provider interaction. I still think it is the case, and this is sort of my 7th point, that beyond research, these vended systems that we deal with today have a hard time scaling. There's no story sort of more well-known in the informatics community than the challenges around the sepsis early warning systems embedded in electronic health records. And whether you try to do that at a national scale, or you try to do it at a local scale, the takeaway is that these models are largely not particularly predictive. They don't generate actionable results, and they don't travel well from one population or setting to another. This is something that people that work in the machine learning or AI space would recognize as sort of common problems with transfer learning and sort of reproducibility. But this is really impeding our ability to move models from one setting to another when we are getting sort of general purpose models from our vendor partners. And so it really begs the question, should we be sharing models, or should we be sharing the methods to be able to produce those models and then tailor and optimize them at a local or regional level? I also, despite sort of my argument that maybe we need to think about sharing methods, want to recognize that the infrastructure today for being able to share knowledge and expertise across various healthcare provider organizations so we understand how to optimally deploy and use AI, that infrastructure is largely non-existent. And this is a great paper from Chris Longhurst and colleagues that calls for this idea of artificial intelligence implementation science centers to help us sort of not only evaluate clinical effectiveness, but also to exchange best practices. And it's a real question. Who is going to be the keeper of the evidence base and sort of the propagator of access to that, so that we're not constantly recreating the wheel in every sort of healthcare setting and environment where we adopt and adapt these technologies? So with that, I want to sort of wrap up with a few kind of integrative comments. First, I'm going to say that charting a path for AI in health and healthcare is going to require us, as I alluded to at the very beginning of this talk, to navigate this balance between overload and insight. So what do I mean by that? So one of the potential outcomes of AI is not positive, right? It could be the case that we use it ineffectively. We don't build the evidence base. We don't evaluate it. We don't use the right standards for comparison. And we actually end up contributing to more information overload. We might actually amplify existing or emergent biases in our system. We could disrupt the focus of our care providers by providing more alerts, and they might be, sort of unnecessary distractions. We might de-skill our providers in terms of, losing human judgment by over-reliance on AI. We can create inequitable access. Certainly when we think about sort of the division between sort of underserved and sort of, well-served urban settings, or even, I think more critically in rural and critical access settings, it's not clear that everyone can benefit from these technologies equally today because of their cost and complexity. And we could just contribute to alert fatigue. These are all very real outcomes if we're not very thoughtful about how and where and in what capacity we use AI. The more positive view of this is that we actually create insight, that by using these AI capabilities in conjunction with unique human cognitive strengths, we could actually provide targeted insights that allow us to sort of get past the flood of data that we're faced with. We might actually build the tools to be able to measure bias in our data and then mitigate it. As I often say to people, bias reduction starts with understanding the sources of bias, and we can measure that in the data if we have the right tools. We could help really provide contextual focus on what matters at the point of care. We could provide highly effective decision support. We could make these tools broadly shareable, back to the idea of implementation science centers of excellence, and therefore create more equitable information distribution. And we can make all of this much more personalized for both providers and patients alike. And this would be sort of the best case scenario. I love this quote from Herbert Simon, which is, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And this is really what we're guarding against. If we don't find a way to make AI additive to the environment in a way that reduces information overload, we will probably see the first scenario that I shared with you. Whereas if we can help people pay attention to what matters, we will achieve that positive outcome. And really what we're trying to do is strike a very delicate balance. And, I describe it as follows. It's sort of a Goldilocks problem. One scenario is that we overregulate or underinvest or sort of fail to advance the field of AI in health and healthcare, and the amount of data that we produce continues to grow at this exponential rate, and we continue to lack the tools to interpret it. That's actually a moral and ethical crisis. That means there are signals in that data that could save lives, and we won't be able to find those signals. And that's scenario one in this slide. Scenario three is the opposite end of that spectrum, which is sort of what is often referred to as the accelerationist view of AI, which would be that we don't put any guardrails around AI. We just build whatever we can, and hopefully the production of data keeps up such that we have enough data to train and evaluate those models. But it's also a highly probable outcome that we just end up with models built on sort of questionable or unknown data sources that have emergent behaviors, and we won't even know why they're doing what they're doing. That's very scary. And so what we have to do as a community is strike the middle ground, which is scenario two, which is really put the structure around the use of AI to advance the state of technology and its use in a responsible and appropriate way that tracks with the continued growth in the data that we have. And this is a very narrow window to hit. It requires the right interplay of governance, investment, innovation, and practice to happen, not to mention education and really workforce development that'll allow people to be the critical consumers that we need to achieve that type of balance. If you want to learn more about sort of the ethical and social and legal and sort of outstanding research agenda questions that might drive our ability to achieve that middle ground that I just sort of alluded to, please take a look at this article, which came out of the recent National Academy of Medicine AI Code of Conduct Task Force. And I'll just sort of leave you with this final quote, which I think is sort of emblematic of, current thinking and how we approach this conversation sort of at the highest level, which is the that I often tell my students not to be misled by the name artificial intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it. AI is made by humans, intended to behave by humans, and ultimately to impact human lives and human society. And this is from Fei-Fei Li, who's a famous computer scientist that leads a really robust human-computer AI interaction program at Stanford University, probably one of the most innovative speakers and thinkers at that intersection of humanism and AI. So at that, I'll just say if you want to learn more about what we're doing at WashU and BJC and sort of the AI arena, take a look at sort of the social feeds for our Institute for Informatics, Data Science, and Biostatistics. We're on most of the major platforms. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody. And hopefully, I sort of didn't leave anyone wanting for content with that. So Sean, I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful, Philip. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to hand this over to Rachel for the Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a question, a comment and a question from Dr. Susan Fisher, who says humans, and particularly physicians, are cognizant of doubts, subtle gaps in information, small, unclear features of information that all contribute to the human decision. AI doesn't seem to be aware of the gaps and patterns. AI never knows it's wrong. Is this a threat as AI is integrated into every increasing complicated decisions? I worry that the last step in AI, that is monitor and optimize, will begin to be overlooked as the technology accelerates even faster. Who is mining the AI store?
Yes, this is a great question, Susan. So I'd start by saying I actually believe that we have technologies at hand that can help us to sort of identify where there are either gaps in reasoning or potential errors in the output of AI. And certainly, for example, in generative AI, when we start using sort of knowledge graphs, for example, with retrieval augmented generation that are based upon sort of well-validated domain knowledge, we can identify these types of features. I think what we're challenged by is that many of the tools that we use, which are very consumer oriented today, are actually designed not to do that because they're actually designed to sort of create a positive sort of user experience rather than sort of one that is factually anchored. And so, one of the things we're going to have to cope with is that the tools we're using right now, especially in the large language model domain, are not really tailored for health or healthcare, right? We're using general consumer models that we're adapting to use in health and healthcare. And so my prediction is that we're going to end up with a lot more sort of smaller domain-specific models that are anchored on sort of these more empiric methods that do identify gaps, but we're going to have to push on that, right? And this goes back to what we do in the research arena versus, what happens in the vendor space. In terms of the sort of fact that monitoring and optimization can get treated as sort of a would be nice, I do think that's a really very real risk. And the thing I always say to everyone at the outset is that we have to treat AI strategy in health and healthcare as a unique integrative sort of discipline that spans data, computation, technology, and clinical operations and transformation. And if we do it that way, I think the value of monitoring and sort of optimization will be clear. But if we treat it as just another technology, no different than installing, Microsoft Office on your computer or an electronic health record, we have a real risk of sort of ending up in the situation that you've described in the second part of your question. So I would say it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we appropriately position AI as sort of this uniquely transformative technology that is more than just technology, right? So it's like how we define informatics. It's people, process, and technology interacting with each other. And I don't think that's any different here.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from Carlos Santos. What is the framework for regulating AI tools when they are brought to the bedside? For clinicians, we are very highly regulated, years of school, years of training, board certification, maintenance of certification. Drugs therapies are highly regulated, phase 1 to 4 trials, comparative effectiveness studies, pharmacovigilance, there you go. For AI, what guardrails are being put up to ensure that AI tools are safe and effective?
Yeah, so good question. I tried to allude to this a little bit. I would start by saying that, if we try to take the guardrails that exist, for example, around novel diagnostics or therapeutics and apply them to AI, we'll actually end up in a pretty challenging space because the fundamental nature of AI is that it's dynamic and it adapts to the system in which it is operating, which is what makes it good at solving some of the problems that we talked about today. The downside is that sort of regulatory regimes like those used by the FDA sort of expect sort of this idea of locking in a sort of, method or molecule or approach in sort of time and space. And that actually breaks the fundamental sort of premise of how AI works. So I would start by saying that I think we're going to have to come up with an alternative way of thinking about sort of regulation, which has yet to emerge. But I have often said to people, if we keep on trying to put that square peg into a round hole, around the use of AI, which is treating it like a diagnostic or therapeutic, we will fail to do so. I think, with regards to sort of guardrails, there are some regulatory hurdles today that allow for sort of validation of sort of the performance of systems, especially in the imaging domain. I think there's a lot to learn there. But a lot of this is happening locally at individual organizations, because the general sort of approach, at least at a federal level, has been that those systems that have a human in the loop are not really regulated in the way that sort of autonomous systems would be regulated. Where we land on that, I think, remains an open question. And I really encourage you, take a look at the report from the NAM. If you don't want to read the 380-page book, I recommend the paper in Health Affairs. That's the abridged version of it. But it speaks to sort of the set of sort of expected behaviors and sort of guardrails that are necessary to be built over the next several years to address these issues. But to your point, is without a doubt the case that humans are held to a much higher standard today than these sort of AI-driven tools are, and we're going to have to figure out how to sort of strike that balance.
Got it. Thank you very much. We have one more question from Dr. Steve Shea. Can you comment on any AI products released within healthcare that are adaptively learning? How do you track performance without a reliable benchmark? How do you avoid sycophantic relationship?
Yeah, I love that question, Steve. So I'm going to go in reverse order. I think the issue of like sycophantic interaction with AI is real. And that is actually manageable, but it requires us to actually tune and sort of, again, manage the models to prevent that. For people who aren't familiar, it's like when you ask a question to ChatGPT or Gemini, like it's always super complimentary. It's like, thank you for asking that question, Dr. Shea. That's a phenomenal question. It actually creates sort of a benign sort of incentive structure to sort of go down these lines of reasoning that may be inaccurate or incomplete simply because of sort of the emotional baggage that is attached to that sort of relationship. That is something that's done in the user interface design of these tools. It is not necessary, and it is something that we can tune out of the systems and should in the clinical environment. It's why, again, these general purpose consumer systems aren't great in the clinical setting. In terms of like products that are adaptively learning, like I'll give a concrete example. I mentioned it earlier. We have a system we've deployed with a vendor partner here today that allows us to scan every single chest image that is generated in the hospital and look for incidental PEs. And one of the things that happens is that we do have an overread and quality control process with our radiologists, because we have a PE response team that will actually go see those patients. And I will share with you, it does miss certain incidences where there's maybe a more difficult to interpret image. If our quality control team sees that, you can actually feed that back to the system. That will actually be used in a knowledge graph layer to improve the performance of the system and ideally sort of reduce the likelihood of that sort of miss the next time. So that's an example of sort of an imaging focused system that's learning through a human in the loop sort of quality control system. Now, tracking performance without a reliable benchmark, I will just tell you, I think first and foremost, every single AI intervention needs to be linked to some sort of clinical outcome of interest, right? So I would argue, rather than comparing to a benchmark, we're really doing sort of quasi-experimental sort of pragmatic studies, right? If we have a sepsis early warning system and we have an intervention strategy that goes with it, does mortality decrease in appropriately sort of demographically or sort of contextually matched cohorts? If I have a PE detection algorithm, are we detecting PEs at a higher incident rate than we were with sort of manual reads prior to the deployment? These are imperfect, but we can also link them to quality and safety and other sentinel events, which I think are important in the system. So one of the things that we do here is we always look backwards from our quality, safety, and outcomes improvement goals and link those to our AI interventions so that we're measuring how the presence of the AI tool in conjunction with sort of human changes in workflow or otherwise sort of contribute to that outcome.
Thank you. I think we're going to take our last two questions. This next question is from Anika Seam. You commented on the important role of governance in ensuring we hit this narrow target, driving us towards the desired scenario too. In your own opinion, what kind of policy propositions might be necessary and beneficial to hit this optimal target zone?
Yeah, I love that question. And I love that I get to like just give my opinion. I think for starters, you know, we're going to have to make substantial investments in the ability to run pragmatic or other studies to show empirically how these tools perform, right? Right now, we're sort of outsourcing, and especially when you think about federal or other research funding, we're outsourcing the bulk of this development to the private sector with the belief that they can move faster and better. I don't think that is true. It's going to require actual relationships between sort of technology, producing organizations and the people that are going to use them to be able to build that knowledge base. So there's going to have to be investment and constructs that make those partnerships possible. I think number two is that we need to create incentives for healthcare delivery systems to adopt and adapt these technologies so we can see what they do at scale. Right now, there's very few scenarios where the use of these technologies, which are very expensive, actually influences reimbursement. And at the end of the day, like healthcare delivery systems and providers behave as they're incentivized. And then I think the third issue, quite honestly, is we do need some appropriate guardrails at sort of the upper bound to make sure that we don't end up in a situation that's sort of that accelerationist view, which is that people are literally building AI tools that have emergent features and we don't have the data necessary to deploy or evaluate them in sort of the real world. So that's really making sure that there is some policy levers to enforce responsible development at sort of the upper bounds of what is possible.
Thank you. Our last question and comment today. This is from Santosh Basapur. Reflecting on the key takeaway I am getting, please correct me if I'm mistaken. The real question is not whether AI enhances or diminishes a provider's abilities, but whether the health system has the design or human factors of maturity to integrate AI responsibly into workflow of the providers. Basically, to use AI to get to overall goals of better healthcare services and outcomes. Also, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, Santosh, you're 100% right. I think the reality is like this is like I said at the very outset, an informatics problem. It's people, process, and technology. And if we think of AI as a technology play and we don't address that intersection with humans and real world workflow, we will not achieve these benefits. There's no doubt about it. It's not magic. It's an enabler for sort of broader transformation in the delivery system. So you're 100% on target with that summary.
All right, thank you so very much, Dr. Payne. I will close out our Q&A right now and hand it over to Dr. David.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you all for the very thoughtful questions. I should just say I used ambient AI for the first time in clinic yesterday, and I was really anxious about it because I thought it would be onerous, time-consuming, and that it would be awkward. But actually, it was underwhelming. It was quite easy to push the button in Haiku and speak to the patient. And the consent part as well was very quick. But it occurred to me later that when a patient says, no, I don't want to be recorded, that there might be a lot in that we don't talk about. And are we really ready to have that conversation? Because it may be that there are things that patients protect patients by saying yes in terms of documenting their concerns and things. But my own sense and instincts are just respect autonomy and move on. Let's not be triggering. But I think what I took away from that is I'm not sure I'm ready to have those conversations. And so there's other things that come up. But anyway, amazing talk, and it covers so much landscape. And so let's go to the Beat the Bot, Ask the Professor session. The first question is, how do we ensure AI reduces cognitive overload and enhances insight in clinical practice rather than adding noise and burden? So we're going to run this through. Open evidence. The brief answer, and this is very boiled down, is AI reduces cognitive overload by automating documentation and streamlining workflows while enhancing insight through pattern recognition in large data sets when implemented as a supportive tool with appropriate oversight. Key mechanisms: ambient AI scribes reduce documentation time. Clinical decision support systems provide context-specific recommendations without overwhelming clinicians. And natural language processing handles routine tasks like inbox management. I wish that all these things were true now, but that would be amazing if that were the new normal. So that's a very boiled down answer. Let's see from the participants. Rachel, can we go to the internet? Oh, and Tony, yes.
So, yeah, no, this is something I do have something to say about. Just yesterday, I downloaded a paper from Harvard Business Review, the title of which is AI Doesn't Reduce Work, It Intensifies It. That's an interesting point of view. And if you think of what, for example, what TikTok is accused of, which is to devising and deploying addictive algorithms, there is a kind of parallel here in which the work becomes compulsive. And I think we've seen a little evidence. This is anecdotal. It hasn't been researched, but I have seen some evidence that clinicians love the ambient tool. They love to work with it, but in fact, when you look at the hours they spend, they don't spend any less time than they used to now. I know Philip's just presented a case study where that is not true, but I wonder how general that finding is.
Yeah, Tony, one of the interesting things, and I'm happy to share more detail on this with everybody here afterwards. We have an interesting finding in our initial pilot adopters of ambient that, the encounters in which the providers are using the technology most sort of intensely and are reporting the most benefit from are actually those that are the most cognitively complex. So, in complex cases, which you can measure through various sort of MDM and HCC codes in an ambulatory setting, we're finding that if it's a relatively simple encounter, our providers are either, just writing a note using their existing templates and, fingers on keyboard, or, dictation in some of the procedural disciplines. And they're sort of using ambient where they need to focus more their sort of attention on a complex case in the room. And I think that's an interesting finding, because the sort of conventional wisdom might be, oh, it's super fast and easy, so I'm going to use it for my quick cases, right? But what we're actually seeing is in the really straightforward cases, that's not really what's happening. But I'd also tell you, I think, I can't help but respond, first of all, I don't know why open evidence thinks it's 90%, because I haven't seen a single paper that actually says that. But what I would say is that, we're considering success like our providers use it in about 30% of their encounters. It's not a panacea. It's good for a very specific set of encounters, and it complements other tools. So to your point, I think that speaks to how the cognitive burden of a given encounter type really matters. And that, of course, relates to the complexity of the task at hand. So this is not as simple as just everyone's going to use it for 100% of their encounters and it's going to be amazing. To the point I think you're making, it's going to require a lot more sort of study to truly understand where and how it's having impact. And the perception of providers on the impact qualitative far exceeds any empiric difference in documentation time. We have physicians that are I'm saving, 4 hours a day on documentation, where you save 30 minutes based upon the data that we tracked, right? So the perceptual benefit is great, and we shouldn't discount that, but it doesn't, so there's clearly something going on there, right? And I think it goes back to that cognitive burden issue.
Yeah. And also, the doctors in the workroom were saying, well, I don't use this on the quick upper respiratory infections, but on the complex patients, maybe older patients with 10 problems on the list, because you just can't capture everything in a quick note. But I mean, the pajama time does reduce a lot for people who see 30 patients a day. Okay, let's do the internet poll. Rachel. Slide. Okay, we should go to the next slide first before we do that. Oh, no, we haven't read. Okay, good. Okay. So everyone, if you could start off, the first question is, how precise was the AI answer? 0 to 10. And well, second one is, how much did AI expand your thinking? And the third is, how much did the AI answer help focus your thinking on this question? The panelists are unable to do the poll. I tried to click and I confirmed that. So,
Let me just see.
okay, Rachel, are we getting some responses?
Yes, responses are coming in. And
Okay. We usually do this for about 30 seconds and look at the responses, and then we can reflect again on that.
all right, are you ready?
Ready? Okay. Kind of across the board in terms of question one, which was how precise was the AI answer? Not very precise. Okay. And then how much to expand your thinking? Again, kind of across the board. So focus thinking. Okay, we didn't get a very focused answer, but there is a much deeper level of sophistication in all the output from that. So one could go deeper and get more information, but it produced an abundance of overwhelming responses that didn't help us focus. Okay, let's go to the second question. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, where should we draw the line between AI as decision support and AI as an autonomous actor, particularly in high-stakes clinical contexts? Okay, open evidence answer is, all right. That's the brief answer. So, you can read this for a second and do the internet poll. I'm not going to read this because it's too much to read.
Okay. All right.
All right, let's go ahead and do the internet poll. How precise? How much did it expand thinking? How much did it help us to focus our thinking? Okay. We still getting responses, Rachel?
Yes.
Do that for 10 more seconds.
And I think we're ready.
Great. Okay. On the issue of how precise, responses were fairly splayed across the board. Expansion of thinking, the same. But on the area of helping to focus thinking, I'd say there was a plurality of people who thought it was moderately useful. And if I had more time, I would definitely be able to take away some important points from that. All right, but I think maybe we'll see how this next question goes. Okay, next question. What structural changes are needed to close the gap between AI research and scalable real-world implementation? Okay. Open evidence answer. Is this the same?
very much the same answer to the second question.
Was the same. Did I is it exactly the same?
Not exactly.
Looks very similar. That is my mistake. I think possibly.
Okay, should we go to the next one?
Let's go to the next one. Yeah, that's what
Can I just comment on something while this is still up? This phrase, meaningful human control, Philip will know this. There's quite a controversy in the informatics community about what is termed the learned intermediary issue, the doctrine of the learned intermediary, which is that no matter how wrong the technical system is, it's the physician's, the provider's responsibility to catch the error. And Philip, I don't know what your feelings are about that issue in relation to AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I tried to allude to, there are a very, very small number of cases where it could be argued that we could have sort of, autonomous AI solutions that do not require sort of the learned intermediary, as we would describe it in the informatics literature, like the imaging cases I described. They generally are places where the risk is relatively low, the need for speed and throughput is high, and the algorithms are extremely high performing, right? So we see this in imaging and a couple other places, but they're without a doubt exceptions. I think by and large, where we're at in sort of complex multi-scale, multimodal learning is that these are augmentation tools that sort of sit alongside and partner with humans. And I think that's consistent with sort of how we think of it. Do I think that'll be the case forever? I don't. I think we'll increasingly see more cases, and we will have to figure out how to navigate that. That will be kind of uncharted frontiers for us.
Okay, so Rachel, let's go to question 4 because I believe I did a copy and paste error. AI could have probably helped me with that. Question 4, what core competencies must the healthcare workforce develop to responsibly navigate AI within a complex and adaptive health system? Okay, and the answer is, all right, healthcare professionals must develop competencies spanning foundational AI knowledge, critical evaluation, ethical reasoning, workflow integration, and collaborative intelligence to responsibly navigate AI within complex health systems. I think this would also adapt to other trainees who are maybe not clinically active, who are doing clinical translational science. Core competencies domains include foundational AI knowledge and literacy, critical appraisal and evidence-based evaluation, ethical reasoning and social implications, workflow integration, and human AI interaction. Okay. Rachel, should we pivot to the poll? Okay, we'll start off. And first question, how precise was the AI answer? How much did the AI answer expand your thinking? How much did it help you focus your thinking? We could run that for about 20 seconds. There's actually a lot in those core competencies in terms of putting them into context of how we would actually use them in the practice. So, okay. On the area of precision, it's kind of splayed across the board, as well as expansion of thinking and focus of thinking. And it may be that, because this is so boiled down, that foundational AI knowledge and literacy, critical appraisal, evidence-based, I think examples would be helpful here. I mean, personally, if I was trying to develop a curriculum, because for one could use this in practice as a clinical decision aid if they knew how to use open evidence and clinical decision support adequately. A lot of that's built into number 2. But what are your thoughts, Philip, on this response? And
Yeah, so I'll share with you just sort of what we're doing here. So we actually have integrated a sort of intensive into our medical school curriculum. We recently refreshed our curriculum. It really focuses on sort of items 2 and 3 in these competency domains. So understanding sort of how to read and sort of review the evidence concerning the impact of AI use, and then how does it impact sort of human cognition, and then really sort of the ethical and social dimensions that surround that. It's been incredibly popular. We do now teach additional AI methods as part of sort of cross-cutting threads related to quality and safety improvement as well. And so I think that's another important dimension. Simultaneously, I will share sort of more broadly that the American Medical Informatics Association right now is working on a competency-based framework for clinician education in this space, and content to sort of support its integration, because I think one of the problems right now is everyone's trying to create the same content like 100 times over. And that's probably not our most effective sort of approach. But I actually think the biggest challenge is not training future clinicians. It's sort of workforce upskilling of the existing clinical and sort of healthcare workforce that, frankly, don't have the time or sort of bandwidth to get into this space, but really do need to be equipped with these competencies. And so still think there's a lot of room for improvement on sort of really the upskilling side of the equation.
so a lot of this gets into workforce development and entire pipelines of training. Yeah. Tony, additional thoughts from the training side of biomedical informaticists? Do you think that these areas are also relevant, or would you say that there are others?
Certainly, they're all relevant. Whether this is everything one needs to take into account, I'm sure cases will arise where you need more than this.
Great. There is a link to, well, I'm not sure if one can go to it live, but there's a good figure in this paper. Breaks this down. Okay. Well, thank you. This is a work in progress, the Beat the Bot exercise, and to do it live can sometimes be, we don't know what we're going to get, but I do think that there is some ability to focus thinking a little bit in this exercise. Actually, I thought the human presentation did a much better job than open evidence. So I will, at this point, wrap this up and say that Dr. Payne gave an incredible overview of the work that's already happening in AI. As a clinician, primary care doctor, I think we're probably closer to scenario 2 in clinical practice than we are in research, which is maybe more like scenario 1, where there's just a lot of data that we want to get to. And it can be distressing to think we're missing signal all the time. But to have a kind of whole world view of this universe of opportunity is very exciting. And we're really privileged to have you here today, and Dr. Solomonides as well. So thank you very much. We are going to, Rachel, is there any more closing business before we wrap this up? Yes, we'd like to get your feedback on the seminar, how it went, how we can improve, but also the things that worked. And we are trying to use AI in this seminar as well as to present AI research and how it can be harnessed to enhance health outcomes. So we're learning as we go on how to use AI in this space. So please take a time to fill out that survey. And also stay tuned for next month. We will have Sarah Rossetti from Columbia University present on her work using generative AI to predict sepsis in a very large scale clinical trial. And then Matthew Thompson from Google Health in May. So thank you very much, Dr. Payne, Dr. Solomonides, Rachel. Rachel, anything else? We're going to be
No,
posting this video.
no. Other than that was a great seminar, and thank everybody very much for all of your input and participation.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.